Thank you for coming to my Scholars Day presentation. I wish it was in real life, but this will have to do. And so my name's Addy Goodman, and I majored in communications and a minor in English writing, and I decided very early on that I wanted to do the honors program, but I decided to push it all into senior year, and so I got to spend the last year rewriting a book that I wrote in the 8th grade. And so my thesis has to do a lot with the black and white of editing, but then also how that correlates into, you know, being an author and an editor and what that means on paper. And so I'll explain more. So the beginning of my thesis started out with a preface, and so my thesis ended up being kind of a big chunk of a work because we put a lot of examples in and copy and pasted some of my past writings in just so that it could be a whole journey. We originally named it The Writing Journey, but then we decided editing the editor was more fitting after we went through the whole process. And so on the screen we have some examples of my early writing and my early idea of what editing was. And so I really dove into writing very early on. I was writing a lot of fiction, a lot of opinion pieces for my mom, and a lot of fake newspapers for my neighborhood that never were put out. But I really wanted to be an editor really all growing up and loved writing. And so we started out in my thesis writing out this preface, and so I was going to read that because it kind of gets to the heart of my work. And so when I was in the 4th grade, sitting at a round wooden table at the end of our kitchen, I wrote the first story that made me proud. My mom, Carrie Goodman, had taught me how to turn the dinosaur of a laptop on, plugging in the dial-up and giving enough time for the machine to whirl to life. At the time, we had a CD player nestled on a shelf nearby, which was where I began my first inklings of a writing process and a writing preference. At that malleable age of barely 10 years old, I preferred a glass of water, Michael Bublé's Crazy Love album on low, and Microsoft Word set to Bookman old-style font. I spent entire afternoons sitting crisscross applesauce in a kitchen chair, my index fingers flying across the chunky keyboard of an old PC. That first story that made me proud was entitled A Journey to Heaven, and it lasted all of about 50 computer pages, single-spaced. It told the story of a brother, sister, and their cousin counterparts as they adventured through the traumatic unfoldings of a house robbery and subsequent family upheaval. It was very unrealistic. I printed the self-proclaimed book and took it to my gifted and talented class at school, where I was given the opportunity to read it in front of my friends and classmates. I was hoping that they would spew my praises, but while reading my work aloud, I began what was the first process of self-editing, stumbling over paragraphs that didn't fit in, sentences that didn't flow, and words misspelled. When I finished reading, I stacked my papers to signal the end. I was aware that I personally had edits to make, yet I knew even then I would be hesitant to make them and didn't want anyone to tell me I needed to. But all I hoped was that my class liked it. Did they see its worth? Did they understand my characters? And did they think I was a good author? Well, then my teacher leaned back and crossed her arms, asking the class to give any pointers, and I sat there, teeth clenched and hands cold, as my hard work was criticized. Unfortunately, every last one of my students, including the teacher, was blunt. I hated being edited. If my writing was good, why didn't they like it? So as I've worked towards both a communications degree and an English writing minor, habitually I've placed myself in roles requiring the written word, as editor of the yearbook, staff writer, and copy editor for the newspaper, casual yet hopeful blogger. I realized quickly on that it wasn't the writing that was hard for me. I spent the majority of my childhood behind a computer screen or with a hand positioned over a journal. I had printed the Ladybug Chronicles, a monthly neighborhood newspaper. I had written short stories about my family, a sequel to my beloved A Journey to Heaven, and opinion pieces on various community issues for only the eyes of my mother. I had received a typewriter for my birthday in middle school, which I wasn't excited about at the time. But I burned through ink telling the stories of my friends and pretend lovers. I had stacks of dusty paper, all the first chapters to some ill-conceived and unfinished book, fluttering wisps of thought that sat in the corner of a closet. 5 inky journals are stacked in my childhood room, full of heartbreaking secrets and lines followed by excited and embarrassing exclamation points. Writing wasn't necessarily the problem. So as I ended the the end of my senior year at Ouachita, I recognized that revision and editing of any sort on my writing, whether that be by myself or by others, was the problem. Through my studies here in college, I have been reaffirmed in the fact that I want to pursue editing for a publishing house. However, through the process of completing this directed study and thesis, I hoped I'd become a better editor through self-criticism. If I could edit myself to the fullest extent, I would be a much better editor for it. So that leads me to the bulk of the thesis, the question of how it might work. How am I going to edit myself? And so it leads into, in the 8th grade, I had my first real English teacher experience, and we had this assignment to write a book, and I took with it and ran. My brother also did the assignment, and his book was like 18 pages long about our mom being a murderer, and my book was almost 200 pages long, diving into the world of Downton Abbey, obviously because the cover of my book was Highclere Castle, which was Downton Abbey, but it dove into just themes that I wanted to declare over my life at the age of 14, and I spent a lot of time on that, and my classmates were not very happy that they had to peer review my excessive chapter book, and I read their one-page book. And so we did that, and looking back on it in college, I knew that I always said I wanted to write a book for my thesis, and then I quickly realized that that wasn't plausible and that wasn't going to happen. And so my smart idea was I was going to take this and I was going to re-edit the book. And so on the next slide, it'll show the process. So we have the concept form, which this was in January of 2013. And so that's the initial, proposing of the book, which was funny because it's the proposing of my thesis years later, but to my 8th grade teacher. And then on the other side, we have what editing looked like at that point. And so this was kind of my first introduction to graded editing and editing put on display. And so it was a very easy process. It took a long time. I was given time, but I was given deadlines and I was given criticism. So it was kind of my first exposure to what it would look like being an editor on a professional sense. And so then when I was thinking about doing my thesis last summer, I chose to do my directed study and my thesis with Dr. Amy Sondheim, who was at the time my children's literature professor. And so I've always wanted to work in children's literature, and it seemed like a perfect fit to go revisit the story then, which I had written in the 8th grade, with a professor who had a passion for children's literature, because I consider that book to be a young adult novel, a YA novel. And so the original plan was to come back through and just edit it. So I was going to come and just look at, grammatical themes or change dialogue, kind of help the character development a little bit more, be more logistical and not big picture. But then we quickly realized within the first week of both of us rereading the book, is terribly embarrassing for me to sit and read through the book that I hadn't read in so long. I was proud of the work I'd done so many years ago, but then it was embarrassing in the sense that I was writing about things I didn't have experience in. I was writing this whole sweeping love story, and I was 14 years old. All these things, and I didn't know how to write dialogue. I didn't know how to write most of this stuff. And so we both came back and kind of looked at each other and said, this is going to have to be completely rewritten. And so that was kind of a daunting task, and we didn't finish rewriting this book, but it wasn't on accident, because the whole process took us through a much deeper idea of what it means to be an editor. And so we ended up having 5 complete drafts of the first chapter. So we didn't finish the last draft of the first chapter until the end of last semester of my directed study, which the original intent was to write a chapter a week, which is comical at this point. So this was the first draft. I sat down, I had gone through the original book and put post-it notes on things that I thought were dumb and needed to be changed, and the nitpicky, and I thought it was going to be much of a read through sentence by sentence and reword it in a way that I thought was more fitting. But then it was just, we realized that my character, Jane, we didn't really understand her. We didn't understand what her intention was. What was I writing for? In the 8th grade, I was writing, just kind of to write about angsty middle school stuff. And so now when we're trying to write with the idea of potentially this one day being published, we had to really understand what Jane was and what the book wanted to portray. And so we did a lot of scribbling down of major things that needed to change, little things that needed to change, what I wanted people to see through Jane. And so then when I came back with this chapter 1, I thought it was a masterpiece, and that's the root of my problem. Every time I write something, I think it's a masterpiece. And so I gave it to Dr. Sondheim, and we now refer to that draft as a kick in the chin, and just kind of a, you know what, Addy, that was terrible and you need to start over. And so we thought about naming the thesis a kick in the chin because everything was a kick in the chin, but that's kind of the point of, me as an editor. And so we kept writing drafts, and through these different, so we kept writing drafts, we kept coming back. I started asking for help with other students who are also in the English department. And so one of our big turning points was I turned to one of my English classmates, Claire Seal, and she was also in the in the honors program, and she was writing an honors thesis on YA novels. And so we thought, okay, maybe she has a different eye since we're the only ones reading it. We're kind of tired of, reading the same things. We weren't understanding what symbolism we wanted. And so we just kept coming back. So we'd rewrite an entire chapter and then have separate drafts on that one and then get back in. And she would say, I don't like that, and we need to do it again. And so through it all, we kind of figured out, how to take the feeling out of the editor and speak honestly to your character. And one thing that was hard for me through this whole thing was when I wrote then, it was very meaningful to me, and those characters meant a lot to me. And they symbolized, I think, one thing that's big, and I'll mention it at the end, one thing that's big about a writer is you're writing about things and people you've loved and experienced. And so to me, Jane and her love interest Philip and her friends and her family, those all represented like a lot of different things to me at that point. And so then it was hard with Dr. Sondheim coming and telling me it didn't make sense that Jane would fall in love with Philip because she didn't know him, and that was accurate. And so in this draft, Philip doesn't exist. And so there's a lot of the big picture and really realizing it wasn't just an occasional adjustment to the comma when editing. It was more of editing the entire thing, editing down Jane, editing what she would want to talk about and what she would really say. And so we finally, the last week in December, came on the first draft of the first chapter, which then was daunting. Like, did she expect me to finish the whole book over Christmas break? Which didn't happen. And it really was never our intention because we really had gotten out of that one semester what we intended to. And the hard part about publishing creative work in a thesis is you don't see all the work, it's all in my head. And so there's so much more work than there is going to be published in the book. But next slide. We completed 4 chapters of the book, and so just as the first chapter went and we had different drafts of that, the following chapters obviously weren't as hard because we kind of had attacked, this is how we want Jane to feel and this is what we want to come out of the book. And so we had completely changed the direction of the book, so chapters 2 through 4, which we wrote, weren't as hard to finish. And so in the end we kind of took away from, and I've said it before, that editing is more than just the black and white. It's everything in between. There's revision, rewriting, honesty to your characters and honesty to yourself as an author, what you actually want them to say, and trying to figure out like how to best say that and not just throw up on the screen, on the paper. One big thing is writing creative work in a deadline setting and in a professional work. I've always kind of seen my creative writing as, well, when I'm inspired, I'm just going to go for it. And so one thing me and Dr. Sondheim talked about is how my dad, he's a florist, and so he has to produce creative work even when not inspired. And I think that's one thing to learn when going into editing and creative work as a professional career is, you can't always just wait for that inspiration to hit, because most of the time it's not. And then we obviously, and I knew this, so much of writing comes from the experiences, relationships, conversations, the things that you learn. One of my favorite quotes on Pinterest is saying, if you meet a writer, you'll never leave her because she'll always be writing you down in some form. And so I think if that's true, this means that I can only get better as a writer as I get more experiences. And so, let me go to the next slide. And so we renamed, which was fitting, we renamed then, and you know, some of my friends, my good friend Nicholas Gerber always made fun of me because I named the book Then, which didn't make much sense. I think Gabe did too. But the whole point in my head, I was thinking, you know, life back then was so beautiful. And like that life that Jane lived then was beautiful. So then I thought it was very abstract. But we completely revisioned the whole thing. And so it was fitting that we named it Jane. So I'm going to read the end of my preface and make sure that I have... Okay, I'm going to read the end of this, and then we're just going to read the first 2 pages of the first chapter, and then open the floor for questions. Okay, the end of the beginning of my thesis. Through the completion of this thesis, I have been given the opportunity to end my academic career on a reflective note. I revisited stories that shaped me into the writer I am today. Allison from A Journey to Heaven inspired so much of who I wrote Jane from Then to Be in 2013. Both still playing roles in new stories I write today. The meticulous grammatical editing I did to old copies of the town newspaper translated to my meticulous writing for campus publications over the past 4 years. My itch to pen the first chapters to non-existent books throughout my childhood molded me into a creative writer, which proved so important as I racked my mind for yearbook themes and feature stories for our untold Washingtonian. When I scribbled messes of thought into old cloth journals through high school, telling stories of dramatic lunch breaks and embarrassing encounters, I was training my mind to be vulnerable, which gave me a foundation when rewriting my Jane character. My writing journey has changed an impressionable, aspiring writer and editor into a published and award-winning one, and now I am giddy to share even just a piece of the process in this portfolio, including the final draft of what is now titled Jane, in honor of all the characters, experiences, memories, and stories she has taken the shape of over the years. This is for Jane, for she is a culmination in written form of all the things I've loved and lived in life. Okay. So, chapter 1. The tea was cold. It was a murky brown, which struck me as odd. I had always enjoyed morning tea in our fine china, but it was the warmth I found comfort in. It always had arrived steamy. The cooks would never allow anything else. I suppose I'd never really tasted tea for tea's sake until this morning. This was a dreadful morning. I closed my eyes. My plate was decorated with jam-slathered crumpets, a cup of steamy oatmeal, and poached eggs, all the things my older brother Charlie had always swooned over. My younger sister Kate and I followed suit, claiming to enjoy all that he claimed first. Therefore, the cooks downstairs would have probably assumed this was the Dawson children's favorite breakfast meal as a whole. As soon as I opened my eyes and glanced at the cold tea and the plate of unwanted food before me, I felt a tinge of queasiness. Charlie had already eaten, apparently. That must have been the reason for the frigid cup of tea. The maids must have brought it up earlier than normal. I wasn't upset at them by any means. The problem was that only hot tea sounded appetizing at the moment, and that was so frustrating to me for some odd reason. I picked up my fork and cut lines in the egg until it was completely burst. Jane. I looked up and carefully slid the utensil onto the plate. My father peered at me over his ironed copy of the London Times. The paper was inky, and I could see where Mr. Hamilton, our butler, had left the iron a moment too long. Dark letters spelled out the date of yesterday's paper, April 25th, 1914. The words were terribly small, so Father's spectacles edging on the end of his nose was entirely fitting. I noticed an advertisement on the back page for a new dress shop, stuck between 2 stories on government. The dress was frilly and of an unbearably green tint. I glanced down at my chest. It was quite like the one I was wearing. Do you know that if your mother sees her 18-year-old daughter making light of her breakfast, she will not be amused, he said. He folded the paper and set it beside him. At least you can drink your cup of tea. I leaned back. It's cold, though. He glanced up at me and shook his head, lifting his own cup and taking a swig. He swallowed, and I heard the gulp in his throat. I winced. I could not ever stand to hear that. It was boorish, to say the very least. Jane, you mustn't let this day get to you. Everybody is feeling what you're feeling. It's no excuse to act like a child. I felt myself become tense, sitting up straighter against my seat back. I knew he didn't mean to sound the way he did, overbearing, apathetic, and cold. At least, I hope he didn't. I knew I was hard to understand, as I myself couldn't even understand much of what I thought. I also knew that this morning reminded me sadly of the morning we first said goodbye to Charlie, the morning he boarded the ship to America for university. It was the same breakfast, the same discomfort, the same fear of what would happen next. At that point in my life, I hadn't realized that growing up and moving on meant experiencing unwanted change. Change, yes, but I never thought I'd resist it. I had always believed that everything would remain somewhat in the same state I'd always known it to be in. Mother, father, and us children, moving through life together. Of course, the goodbye 2 years ago didn't seem as final as today's would. Today felt like the final sentence in a book I'd been reading forever. I lifted the china cup up to my mouth and started to tip it back, preparing myself for the tepid tea and trying to hold my tongue from any unladylike response. But out of nowhere, I heard the painful sound of metal falling upon metal, landing with a clang on the hardwood floor. My hand jerked, and the tea spilled down the entire front of my dress. My chest was left clammy and stained with the sweet smell of rotten old leaves. Please forgive me. I'm ever so sorry, miss. Please let me get that for you. The new maid scurried over to me, leaving the fallen tea tray and pot seeping onto the floor. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw Father leave to get Mr. Hamilton, most likely to clean up the mess. I'm ever so sorry, Lady Jane. I do not know what happened. She lifted the corner of her apron up and began patting my dress. I could feel her hands shaking and beads of sweat forming on her forehead and upper lip. Her eyes were damp. I watched her, struggling to find something acceptable to say. It was entirely her fault, and I knew that. I knew that the proper thing to do was to let her take full ownership instead of me, inform Mr. Hamilton of the mistake. But I also knew she couldn't be more than 1 year older than me, and how could I reprimand an equal? What's your name? I asked, motioning her back. She threw her hands behind her back and jumped to stand away from the table. My name is Rose. I started here at the start of the month. I've only served 3 times, and I'm still working on my balancing. I pushed my chair back and stepped toward her. Rose, there's no reason to be all up in a tizzy. Mr. Hamilton will tend to this, and for now I'm going to go fresh up. You just begin picking up the dishes from breakfast. I'll be sure nothing happens on your behalf. I touched her elbow, trying to comfort her. She avoided eye contact and nodded quickly. Yes, ma'am. I thought about turning to Rose and requesting she also tell downstairs that I'd like to have my tea piping the next morning. Instead, I was smart. I left the room, too startled by the eerie familiarity of this morning to so many other poor ones. It brought me back to the busy morning of my presentation to society just a few months earlier, and how dreadful that day was. How dreadful it was to wake up in a bed that wasn't my own. Our home in London always left me sleepless and rather uncomfortable. We did not spend enough time there to feel welcomed, but presentation was the very most valuable event of my life. After my wedding, of course, according to Mother, and we needed to be at our best. Meanwhile, we had to stay in our London home for the time being. I had eaten breakfast with Father that morning, just as this morning, but that time it was me who so recklessly knocked the plate into my lap. I was restless and not paying enough mind to my surroundings. The maid there also hurried to my aid, just as Rose did, insisting it was entirely her fault, despite the obvious fact she had been standing 10 feet away. I had avoided Father's concerned gaze and rushed out of the room before anybody else saw the mess I had made. I hadn't wanted to give him the chance to ask what was wrong. But now here I was, standing at the top of the stairs in our magnificent manor in the countryside, the skin on my chest damp from murky tea, my new dress soiled, and my spirits dwindled. How could one moment feel so much like another? The end. So the next slide is just kind of a funny slide. I just needed to put it in there. The whole thing was me wanting to learn how to be an editor, and I've always wanted to work in publishing, and so just the full circle event that the week I present my senior thesis was the week I was hired at AY Magazine in Little Rock to work on their writing staff. And so hopefully one day you'll be watching this on YouTube and look me up, and I'll be an editor for a publishing firm. So I would like to thank Dr. Amy Sondheim and all the hard work she gave to me, even though I was not the very best student that I could be. She just really motivated me and helped me to do my very best. And a huge thank you to Dr. Barbara Pemberton for her staying on me until I finally agreed to do the honors program, and I will be forever better for it. I am not an honors student. I am honored to be in the honors program, and so thank you all, and I hope you enjoyed watching.